Joining us today. Appreciate everybody taking the time out of their busy days to talk a little bit about some of the aspects of our Fanatical Support for AWS offering. I am joined today by Brad Gignac, who is our lead engineer for Fanatical Support for AWS as well. So he and I will be handing off throughout the presentation as we go through some of the details. Again, if you do have any questions as we're walking through the slides, please use the chat in the webinar. We will be addressing all questions at the end of the presentation today. So let's go on ahead and get started. So what we're going to talk about today during the webinar is a little bit about AWS best practices and why automation is such an important aspect of maintaining those best practices when you're working with Amazon Web Services. We're going to dive in a little bit to each of our core tools that are a part of our offering. We're going to talk about Compass, Watchman, Passport, and Logbook. And we'll go into some details on each of those, both what they solve for, as well as how they take some of the repetitiveness out of things that you would need to otherwise do to maintain best practices on your AWS account or set of accounts. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we've actually built our tooling on top of AWS, taking into account many of those same best practices. So we'll go into some details on some of the services that we use from AWS, how we use those in our applications, and really how, at the end of the day, we leverage the same best practices and same capabilities and same tooling to run our own infrastructure that we use to deliver service to our customers. So when we think about AWS best practices and sort of why automation is necessary, the AWS really does present a complex set of services and tools. I think at last check, there's anywhere north of somewhere right around 50 services that are offered through AWS. Managing all of that complexity really is a full-time job. If you think about a enterprise application portfolio or even sort of a mid-market organization's application portfolio, you're going to have multiple AWS accounts. You're going to have usage across a number of different services, and really making sure that the best practices are in place across that set of accounts, that you have a set of default standards across those accounts, that you're doing authentication in the same way, that you're managing your logging in the same way, is a growing problem of complexity. So managing that really can be a full-time job. But there is an opportunity here, and one that we have seized as we've built the Fanatical Support for AWS offering. And that is that there are many of those best practices that on a platform like AWS, where you have APIs and you have programmatic access to the platform as a whole, you have an opportunity to build tooling on top of those best practices to reduce that complexity. So many of the tools that we're going to be talking about today are created directly from our experience managing customer applications on top of AWS. So if you think about the specific challenges that we encounter account by account, customer by customer, we really have built a set of tooling that comes out of those experiences. So again, building tooling focused around those specific repetitive things that occur on every account is one of the primary ways that you can reduce the complexity of the AWS environment. As AWS launches new regions, as AWS launches new services, making sure that you have that tooling and that tooling is able to adapt to that ever-changing environment is extremely important. I do want to take a moment before we jump into the specific tools just to call out that there really are two primary components of our offerings. There's the tooling and automation aspect, which is really what we're focusing on today. But there's also the human expert or human expertise aspect of the offering, or what we call Fanatical Support. And it really is important to understand that both of those are what come together to give you that experience. So while we're not going to talk a lot today about the sort of human expertise component of the offering, we are going to focus on tooling and automation. But just keep in mind that both of those are core tenets of our offerings. So let's jump in to a little bit of detail on each of the individual tools themselves. So the first one I want to talk about is actually right at the intersection of that tooling and automation and human experts combination there, and that is Compass. Compass is our tool that we have built that combines information from AWS Trusted Advisor as well as recommendations that reflect our experience, so our rackers that are on our front lines supporting our customers day in and day out. It combines that set of recommendations that come from those rackers with the recommendations that come from AWS Trusted Advisor to provide you a single view of the things that are important about your accounts. So if you think about things like account configuration, security, identity management, etc., all of those domains are covered by Compass. And one of the really neat things about many of our tools is that you are going to see us provide a view across multiple AWS accounts. We realize that organizations will typically have more than one AWS account. It's extremely rare that you would run across a customer that would only have a single account. Typically, accounts are used for things like multiple applications or application teams. They can be used to divide up environments like development, staging, production. But all of those sort of things lead to a growing number of AWS accounts. So Compass, as many of our other tools, as we'll talk about a little bit later, seeks to bring all of that information together for you in a single view. So you can very quickly identify the things that are warnings or errors about your entire portfolio of AWS accounts. So if you perhaps have deviated from a best practice that we recommend or that AWS recommends, we will bring all of that to your attention right here in the view in Compass. And you can see the screenshot to the right of the slide there. In this case, everything is green, but you would very quickly be able to filter down to warnings or errors. And again, you're seeing across all regions, across all AWS accounts in the environment, that single view. And really, at the end of the day, this automates that repetitive task of ensuring that your AWS accounts meet both our best practices as well as AWS's best practices. So that's an extremely important way that we are able to scale Fanatical Support and bring that experience to our customers across the board. And this is something that you can access at any point in time through our customer control panel. You have the ability, if you make a change, to remediate something that is addressed by one of these checks. You can immediately, in real time, refresh the results to see that has actually resolved the issue. Conversely, if you were to make a change and you were concerned that it may have negatively impacted one of the opinions that we have about your account, you could make that change and then refresh and get that same real-time view. Moving on from Compass, the next important tool that we have in our tool belt is something called Watchman. And what Watchman is responsible for doing, many of you are likely familiar with AWS CloudWatch, which is the sort of native built-in monitoring platform within AWS. CloudWatch has the ability to send out monitoring notifications anytime an alarm or an alert deviates from a specific value. So for example, if you wanted to set a CloudWatch alarm up based on the CPU across your web servers, or you wanted to set up an alarm for the number of bytes transferred to your Elastic Load Balancer, etc., you can do that, and then you can actually configure Watchman to route those alarms to Rackspace support. So this is actually, again, a really powerful combination between that tooling as well as our human experts. So you have the ability to configure an alarm, and instead of having it page you or call you at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can configure it to page a racker that is going to be available on shift via a support ticket. This is extremely straightforward to configure. Essentially, when you work with Fanatical Support for AWS, there will be an SNS topic or simple notification service topic that will be automatically created on your account. It's called Rackspace Support. And all you would do when you were configuring that CloudWatch alarm is you would go in and you would set the SNS topic to point to Rackspace support for any notifications. And then what will happen anytime that alarm fires, a support ticket will be created and you'll receive a response from a Racker. You can work with your support team to define what you want that response to be. Perhaps it's that you want us to go in and restart a service or spin up additional nodes for your application, et cetera. Or perhaps it's that you want us to call a specific member of your operations team during specific hours, et cetera. So you have the ability to work with your account team to customize the response that we take. And this is a great way to prevent you from having to respond to each of those alarms yourself at 3 o'clock in the morning. The next tool in our tool belt is a tool called Passport. When you think about accessing your environment at AWS, so for example, you have created a VPC, you have spun up some web servers, some application servers, some database servers. You have a couple of different options when you think about how you want to access those servers. One option, and one that definitely deviates from best practices, would be to put all of those servers in the public subnet and open up the security groups to allow either SSH or RDP globally from anywhere on the internet. Again, that strongly would deviate from best practices because you're opening yourself up from a security perspective. Conversely, the better option, and the option that does align with best practices, is to create one or more Bastion hosts or Bastion instances in your environment and leverage those as a jumping off point to access SSH or RDP on your servers. Place your actual servers, your web nodes, your database nodes, et cetera, in a private subnet in your VPC. Don't assign them individual public IP addresses because they probably don't need them. And then leverage that Bastion host as that jumping off point. What Passport does is we actually take that one step further. You'll typically see that somebody will go out and provision a Bastion instance, and they will leave that Bastion instance running. They'll share it amongst their team. They may even open up SSH globally on that instance versus doing specific IP whitelisting. And that Bastion instance over time becomes stale. It doesn't get patched. It doesn't get updated. And it's used by a large number of members of a team. When we built the Fanatical Support for AWS offering, we realized that we had an opportunity to solve this problem. So we built Passport. Passport provides single-use Bastion instances that are provisioned for a specific user with access to a specific set of resources for a very short period of time. And at the foundation of Passport is something that's called an access request. So this is the way Rackers access customer environments, and we also make it available to you as a customer to be able to access your environment should you choose to do so. So the way you would do this is when you needed access to specific resources in your account, you would come and you would create an access request. You specify the VPC, you specify the reason you need access, you define the source IP address that your request is going to come from, and then you pick the specific AWS resources that you need access to. Once you create that access request, what we're going to do is go out and provision a temporary Bastion instance on your account. We're going to keep that Bastion instance around by default for 55 minutes. You can extend that if you need to. And then we're going to create and modify the appropriate security groups to allow only your IP address to connect to the Bastion, and that Bastion to access only the resources that you defined as part of the access request. So all of this is tracked, audited, logged. It actually shows up in our logbook capability, which we'll talk about here in a couple of moments. And then at the end of the access request, again, by default, after about an hour, we will tear down the Bastion instance, the security groups, et cetera. So your environment goes back to just the way it was prior to the access request being created. So this is a great way to ensure that you don't have shared Bastion instances, you don't have long-lived Bastion instances, you don't have to worry about patching and updating those long-lived persistent Bastion hosts, etc. So this automates that repetitive task of having to create and manage those Bastion instances or modifying security groups. The last thing you want to do is every time you have to log into your environment, have to go out to the AWS console and manually modify the IP addresses within the security groups to allow you access to your instances. And again, just to reiterate, this is the mechanism that our rackers use in our Aviator service level to actually access your account. So you can rest assured that we are leveraging secure best practices each time we log into your account. We don't maintain any persistent connectivity or anything like that into your environment. Last but not least, from a tooling perspective, we have a tool called Logbook. And what Logbook does is it provides you a blended time series view of all of the activity that's occurring across your accounts, both from a Rackspace perspective as well as from an AWS CloudTrail perspective. So one of the main challenges that we hear from customers time and time again is when I get a brand new AWS account, I need to go out, I need to set up CloudTrail, I need to do that across each of my accounts. I need to do that in every region as AWS launches new regions. I need to remember to go back and update my settings, etc. And then when I want to view that information, if I want to look and see has anything happened in my account, perhaps in regions that I don't expect activity to be occurring in, or I just want to look across my account and see everything that happened yesterday, that type of thing. What Logbook does is provide you that unified view of that information. We also complement that, though, with information from our systems. So for example, in the previous slide, when we created that access request via Passport, that access request would be logged here in Logbook. So you would be able to see at a quick glance, and you can filter down based on region or event name, activity source, etc. You can see at a quick glance what has been occurring in your accounts. So instead of having to go out and check individual log files across separate UIs, etc., you can get that unified view of what's happening across your accounts via the Logbook capability. Now that we've talked a little bit about the tooling that we offer as part of the Fanatical Support for AWS offer, I want to turn over to Brad Gignac, again, our lead engineer, to talk a little bit about how we actually run our tooling on top of AWS. So each of the tools that you've just seen now, some of the services that we use, and some of our experience running an engineering organization that is constantly deploying to AWS. Brad?
Thanks, Chris. So I want to spend the next few minutes discussing how we built our tooling on AWS, and perhaps more importantly, why we built our tooling on AWS. So the primary reason that we have decided to build our tooling on top of AWS is that we want to build platform expertise. Expertise is a huge part of the value that we offer to our customers, and I really see two pieces to that expertise. One of them is training, and Rackspace has hundreds of AWS certifications. However, we thought it was also very important to complement the training with real-world, large-scale experience operating applications on top of AWS. And I think that's just what we've done with all of our tooling. As you can see on the slide, all of our support tooling is deployed on AWS, and wherever possible, we prefer to use native AWS services as opposed to rolling our own solutions. You can see to the right of the slide, we are currently using over 20 AWS services in production today, and that's a number that is growing pretty rapidly as well as we continue to build out our tooling. Ultimately, we want our tooling to be a case study for how our customers should run applications on AWS. We want to take all of the lessons that we learn in deploying our applications and use that to improve the quality of the solutions that we build for our customers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. As we went through the process of building out our tooling, we also found another great reason to build our tooling with AWS native services. and that was that we wanted to enable our small engineering teams to move very quickly. The initial tooling that Chris described was built out over a period of 4 months by a team of about 8 developers. However, at launch, most of the developers on our team had only been Rackers for about 6 weeks. So for the majority of that 4-month development period, it was about 2 to 3 developers who were working on building out these tooling. And so we had a lot of choices to make. For example, do we want to use DynamoDB, or do we want to build out our own Cassandra cluster? Similarly, we had to make the decision, do we want to use Elasticache, or do we want to build our own HA Redis clusters? And ultimately, we decided that we wanted to be able to focus on shipping our tooling and delivering customer value instead of spending lots of engineering cycles doing things that AWS could deploy and run for us. And I want to call out, I think this is only possible in AWS. They have a depth and breadth of services that I think is the envy of all cloud providers. So they are really great when you want to enable your small teams to build things quickly. So as we went and built out our services, we built them out as microservices. We have a collection of about a dozen microservices that are developed using continuous integration and deployed using Circle CI and Amazon ECS. I want to talk a little bit about why we chose microservices and how AWS helped us down that path. So first, we chose microservices because they reduce development complexity and increase the velocity of our development team. And they allow us to independently scale and build out workload-specific infrastructure for those services. However, microservices come at a cost. Microservices introduce substantial operational complexity. And one requirement for our microservices architecture was that these microservices become easy to build out and operate. Some of the concerns that we had were around building out multiple deployment pipelines for each AWS service. We had to make sure that all of our services were monitored and that we had alerting when there were issues with them. And finally, we had logging and metrics for all of our services that we needed to be able to deploy. So in a very naive solution to these problems, you would end up with redundant infrastructure for, say, logging or, say, monitoring. And oftentimes, it would be very time intense to build out these solutions for every microservice. However, the breadth of AWS services really allowed us to build these things out quickly and simplify and reduce the complexity of our infrastructure. I want to talk specifically about a few things that I think have made a big difference in our ability to deploy these services. First, I want to talk about Amazon ECS. Amazon ECS is a way to deploy Docker containers across a cluster of EC2 instances. As we built out our microservices infrastructure, this allowed us to very quickly deploy as part of our continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. We've also heavily leveraged Amazon Lambda. Amazon Lambda is a serverless computing environment, and it has allowed us to dramatically reduce the amount of infrastructure that we run on AWS. Finally, I want to call out DynamoDB specifically. We use DynamoDB heavily for storage of NoSQL data as well as time series data that is used in our Logbook product. One decision that we had to make was whether we wanted to use DynamoDB or roll out our own Cassandra cluster. This was an interesting problem for our team. Several members of our team have experience operating very large-scale Cassandra deployments, so we have a lot of expertise there. However, we also knew that Cassandra is very time-intensive and very operationally intensive. And so we ultimately ended up choosing DynamoDB as opposed to rolling our Cassandra cluster. This turned out to be a huge time saver during those initial 4 months of development, and that continues today. We've experienced similar gains with using Kinesis over Apache Kafka, as well as the hosted Elasticsearch service over rolling out our own Elasticsearch infrastructure. The final service that I want to call out is Amazon's Simple Workflow service. Process automation is a huge part of what our development team builds. And I have a few examples of that. The best example of that is Passport. So Passport, as Chris mentioned, is a service that allows us to dynamically deploy SSH bastions into your environment. And so this is a pretty complex process. We need to spin up instances in your environment. We need to modify networking in your environment to allow firewall and VPC connectivity. We need to authorize SSH keys to be used temporarily. And then once you're done, we need to tear it all down. Simple Workflow service allowed us to build this out quickly and easily and saved us many, many hours of development time compared to rolling our own workflow engine or using an off-the-shelf solution that we had to operate ourselves. So the final thing that I want to mention with our microservices architecture is that we operate quite a bit of infrastructure, and we deploy every day, many, many times via chat ops in Slack. So currently, we are running our tooling across about 10 different AWS accounts that we use for segregating different applications as well as different application environments. We have a total of 20 VPCs, and in these VPCs, we have dozens of services and hundreds of Docker containers in production at any given time. So since January 1st of this year, our team of 8 developers has performed 1,200 deploys to production, and we cycle hundreds and hundreds of Docker containers every single day as part of our continuous deployment pipeline. I'll move next to a very simple snapshot of one of our VPCs that we deploy our applications in. So this is a very standard AWS build-out. We run elastic load balancers and NATs in a public subnet, along with databases and application servers in a private subnet that is not accessible to the outside world. This is where ECS has really benefited us a lot. In the middle of the diagram, you see the app server label. And these are all instances that are part of an ECS cluster. This allows us to run dozens of different applications in a shared cluster and minimize the amount of operational overhead for running many microservices. The other thing that I want to call out about this environment is that this looks very similar to the publicly accessible CloudFormation templates that we publish for all of our customers. One of the important pieces of us running on AWS, as I mentioned earlier, is that our applications become a case study for how our customers can build and run on AWS as well. And our experience building out and running on AWS has directly affected the CloudFormation templates that we build and send to our customers. With that, I'll hand it back over to Chris to wrap up.
All right, thanks, Brad. So in closing, we really think that the tooling and automation that we have built are a key component of our Fanatical Support for AWS offering. They are, again, one of 2 primary components combined with our human experts that allow you to reduce the complexity of your deployments at AWS. We've built our own tooling on top of AWS, which has given us key insights into the challenges our customers face, and we've incorporated those learnings into our support offerings. So you've seen examples of that today as we've talked through the tools that we provide that make it easier both for our rackers and for you as our customers to manage your deployments at AWS. If you'd like to learn more about Fanatical Support for AWS, you can visit rackspace.com/AWS or follow our blog at the link on the screen. Thank everybody for their time today. Again, if you have questions after the webinar, please reach out to us. Our team is always ready to respond. You can follow the contact link on rackspace.com/AWS. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for joining today.